Jill.
Thank you, Mr. Commissioner. Before we start today, I just wanted to advise the participants that we received over the last, I guess it was Friday, questions and answers to the questions that were posed to Carl English back in April, and I intend to have those marked with the questions and the answers marked tomorrow morning. So if anybody has any objection to that, they should let me know. So starting with the evidence today, Ms. Walls, yesterday when you were giving your evidence, you referred to two documents which we didn't pull up on the screen. I just want to confirm this is what you were referring to. You talked about a 1987 regional working agreement between DFO and Environment Canada, and I believe that's already marked as an exhibit in these hearings at Exhibit 690. So if that could be pulled up and you could just identify if this is what you were referring to.
Yes, that's when I referred to the Regional Working Agreement of 1987. That's the document.
Okay, and then the other agreement you talked about was a Memorandum of Understanding dated 1985, and I believe that is Exhibit 689 in this hearing.
Yes, I confirm that's the 1985 MOU that I spoke of yesterday.
Thank you. Now, when we left off at the end of the day yesterday, you were talking about organizational changes within Environment Canada around 2005 and what the impact of those changes were on the work being done in BC. And I wonder if you could just go describe that for us again.
Okay, so I think I was actually still responding to your question about the effect of on EC's contaminants in Section 36 work due to loss of the water quality unit, and I would just like to summarize my response to that question that with the exception of the work on the MOU and the regional working agreement that was identified in the list of issues in the letter from response from Don Fast to Mr. McGilvery, the letter of August 3rd, 2004. Those first two items, there was really no interest in to continue to do any work on the MOU or regional working agreement updates. All of the other issues, I think, in many areas, I would say that the work, the coordination that was previously done through the water quality unit was lost. However, within the departments, we sort of redid the wiring, so we found new ways to cooperate on or collaborate on a project or program-specific basis. But the real loss was the window into DFO for expertise on effects of pollutant discharges on water quality to sustain fish.
And you had also touched on changes within Environment Canada's governance structure. Can you explain what those changes were, just in a very brief way, and what the impact was on your work?
Around 2004, the department embarked upon a major organizational and structural change. We had a new deputy minister, Deputy Sammy Watson, who had an objective and a goal to completely redesign the architecture of the department. This was over the period from about 2004 to 2006. There was a major redesign of the priority setting, the governance structure, the organizational structure, the way that planning and priority setting was done, and ultimately that led to a new results-based planning and accountability structure for the department, which also translated into a new way of setting budgets and funding allocations. And as a result of, there were two main results in the region that led to a reduced capacity to continue Section 36 Fisheries Act compliance promotion work, or to take on any additional work related to water quality science. And that was, first of all, there was the leadership or management accountability for Fisheries Act Section 36 compliance promotion. It basically disappeared in the new outcome-based management accountability framework for the department. So there was no overall lead or strategic direction or management accountability for our work on Fisheries Act compliance promotion. This Fisheries Act Section 36 compliance promotion. Because the new results-based accountability structure also set the budgets, there was no funding allocated or resourcing to continue with compliance promotion work related to the general pollution prevention provisions under the Fisheries Act. And so the minimal amount of staff that we did have to work on the general fisheries pollution prevention compliance promotion work related to Fisheries Act Section 36 disappeared. So this was going on, this organizational change, and basically elimination of a nominal amount of funding that went into our Fisheries Act compliance promotion work was going on at the same time as DFO disbanded the water quality unit. So it was kind of the perfect storm of events. Of DFO was winding down their coordination in this area, and Environment Canada's management accountability and resourcing for this work was similarly, it wasn't that it was intentionally cut, it just sort of amidst a major organizational change and other issues, particularly related to major new responsibilities under the Canadian Environmental Protection Act, that support for Fisheries Act Section 36 work basically just disappeared. And the department's response in the region was to set up a Fisheries Act working group where we basically got together all the people that had various bits and pieces of expertise and work that they'd previously done related to Section 36 of the Fisheries Act. And we set up a priority setting exercise and a way of identifying priorities and risks that we then used to identify the areas that we wanted to pursue funding. And so we actually put together, as a result of that risk assessment priority setting exercise, identified priorities, and then we would put forward funding proposals to continue to do work on Fisheries Act compliance promotion. But the proposals actually had to go into the SEPA compliance promotion planning and budgeting system, because there was no framework in the management structure for Fisheries Act work. So we had to put in proposals for Fisheries Act 36 compliance promotion priorities to try and get support through the SEPA compliance promotion budgeting process.
And did you ultimately get funding to do that work?
We did get some very specific project-related funding. So we would get, like, I think there was some funding that was provided to do compliance promotion related to boatyards and marinas. So they were specific, one-time, one-year funding, operational budget funding to do things like develop educational materials and best management practices, and to do some limited compliance verification inspection work.
Was that then the only example of funding being made available for the general?
That's the only one I can recall. There may have been some others, but it wasn't like funding a full-time position or anything like that. It was, project-related work.
So it was a reduction to what was happening prior to 2004.
That's correct. And the other thing that was going on organizationally is that, and it's very relevant to the non-point source and urban pollution theme of this session, is that one of our key funding sources for that work was the Georgia Basin Action Plan. And one of the department's priorities was non-point source pollution, in particular agricultural and urban runoff. There was also enhanced water quality monitoring in the Georgia Basin, including the Lower Fraser watershed, that was came through the Georgia Basin Action Plan initiative. That initiative sunsetted. It was 5-year sunset funding. It ran from 2003 until 2008. However, the last year was very nominal funding just for reporting and write-up. So basically, we were coming to the end of our funding under the Georgia Basin Action Program that supported enhanced work on agricultural and urban runoff. And that wound down around 2006, 2007. So there was a number of things. It was just not by design, but on both sides, DFO and Environment Canada had reduced capacity to continue this work. Other priorities were taking their place, and people were reassigned and redirected.
Thank you. I'd like to move now to Dr. Carey and talk a little bit about what water quality monitoring work is being done in BC. You have an agreement between Canada and the province on water quality monitoring, and that should show up as tab 29. I confirm that's the provincial federal agreement on water quality monitoring in BC?
Yes, it is.
Okay. Could I have that mark, please?
Exhibit 992.
Okay, can you, for us, just outline in a general way what the intention is to do under this agreement with respect to water quality monitoring?
This agreement is one of a number of federal provincial agreements on water quality monitoring in general that was stimulated by the Canada Water Act and some of the intentions and goals of that act. The Canada Water Act recognizes that there are different types of water in Canada. There's federal water, such as boundary waters like the Great Lakes. There's waters of federal interest that cross international boundaries. Also under our Constitution, however, there are waters, fresh waters within provinces that are not federal waters but are provincially managed. And the Act empowers Minister of the Environment to enter into agreements with provinces so that there can be joint data collection, for example, between provinces and the federal government to coordinate programs and ensure that there's some sort of synergy between the programs, and in order to implement those intentions, a number of federal provincial agreements were signed, beginning with Quebec, I think, about 2 years before this one, and I believe the Canada-BC agreement was the second one under the Act.
And what, under this agreement, what kinds of things are measured or monitored?
Well, there's a list of core parameters under the agreement, things like temperature, conductivity, nutrients, various types of nutrients, nitrogen-containing, phosphorus-containing substances. And then there are a secondary list of parameters that might be measured on a site-specific basis, metals, some cases organic pollutants like organochlorines, etc.
Okay, and those are, at the time the agreement was signed, those parameters were set out in schedules to the agreement. I don't think the pages are numbered, unfortunately, so Mr. Lund, if you could move through maybe 10 pages in the document, we should get to the schedules of parameters. It's there. Schedule B sets out the monitoring activities at the different sites in BC.
That's the identification of the sites, yes.
And then if we move further along, we'll see the different parameters that are monitored. They're written sideways on your screen there.
By site, so you
By
can...
site. And is the provincial water quality monitoring network part of this arrangement? It's
I
all
believe that's my understanding, yes.
integrated together. And as I understand it, there's a business plan that's prepared in relation to the water quality done in the provinces over 3-year periods. Is that right?
Business plan is, I understand, prepared every 3 years, but there's an annual work plan that's developed each year, I believe.
Okay. If I could take you to the business plan, at least that I think is helpful in showing what things are being looked at. This is business plan tab 30 for the years 2010 to 2013. So this is the current business plan. Is that right?
Yes, that's my understanding.
All right. Have that marked, please.
Exhibit 993.
Do you know how many stations, water quality monitoring stations, there are in BC? Or sorry, on the Fraser system?
I believe there are 6, 4 in the main stem and 2 in tributaries.
Is there also a buoy in the estuary that's maintained?
Yes, there is.
Okay.
A real-time monitoring buoy in the estuary.
Okay. And is that part of this agreement as well, the buoy? Or is
Yes,
that
it is.
Okay.
It's considered a federal provincial site.
Okay. And earlier in these hearings yesterday, we identified an email from Beverly McLaughlin, which I should get you just to confirm. It's at Exhibit 977. You're familiar with this email that sets out the information prepared by Beverly McNaughton as to the different parameters monitored in the Fraser system at the bottom and going over to the next page?
Yes, I requested that. I was Director General at the time of the unit that Ms. McNaughton works in, and I requested that she provide our response to the Commission for data
Okay,
collected by this network.
thank you.
This was her response.
Okay, so she's taken the different information and kind of put it together in one place for easy reference for us.
Well, she tried. The current water quality information is maintained in different databases by the federal government and the province. The federal database is called EnviroDat, and she pulled the data from EnviroDat, both for the currently active stations and for some that had been active in the past but are no longer active.
And to the best of your knowledge, this is accurate for the Fraser?
It's accurate. It's our data for the Fraser, and to the best of my knowledge, it's accurate, yes.
If you could, Mr. Dunn, put Exhibit 993 back on the screen. This is the business plan. Start on page 5. It sets out some risks and opportunities at the bottom. There, and carries on over to page 6. So this identifies that there's 39 long-term monitoring stations in BC. You see that in the second bullet.
Yes,
Okay, and that, of course,
that's for
relates
all of BC, not just the Fraser.
to the whole province, exactly, and there's only 6 on the Fraser.
Correct.
Okay. And in this paragraph, this report does state that 39 stations is too sparse to be representative of water quality in the province. Would you agree that 6 stations on the Fraser is also too sparse to be representative of water quality on the Fraser?
It depends on your definition of representative. We have stations that are upstream sites considered above sites of pollution, and the farthest downstream at Hope. So it's representative in a broad way of water quality conditions, but it is not representative of a number of water quality at any specific site that isn't being monitored.
Is comprehensive monitoring of the aquatic environment, including bottom sediment and aquatic biota, conducted on the Fraser?
Again, you're asking me, what's your definition of comprehensive? I also, if I could just draw your attention to something, the unit is a water quality monitoring and surveillance unit. And you're focusing on the monitoring component, which is the component that's done bi-weekly in many cases and for specific parameters. The purpose of that is largely to determine the current state and to compare it with past monitoring to determine trends. For specific issues, we conduct surveillance studies. For example, if we wanted to know more about an issue like pesticides, we would conduct a one-time surveillance study. They may go over several years, it may be national in scope, and produce surveillance reports which are intended to help us give more detail to the issue in terms of geography and specifics of chemicals. And we would go back in 5 years' time to determine if anything had changed. And so it isn't all of our work that's represented here. This is just the routine work designed to tell us if things are generally getting better or worse over time.
In this paragraph, it says, in addition, the monitoring focuses on the quality of the water column and comprehensive monitoring of the aquatic environment, including bottom sediment and aquatic biota. And they note that it's done only infrequently. You see that in the...
I see that. That's
Right.
what I
That's-
was referring to by the surveillance studies.
Okay. So, so you would say that there's infrequent surveillance on the bottom sediment and aquatic biota on the Fraser.
Yes.
The statement here is, at the very last sentence, says the risk to government partners is that they do not have a comprehensive overview of aquatic environmental quality in the province for informed decision-making and state of environment reporting. Do you agree with that statement?
Yes, on a province-wide basis, I agree with that.
And if we bring it down to the Fraser, do you agree that we have sufficient and comprehensive overview of aquatic environmental quality in the Fraser to allow for informed decision-making on the Fraser system?
Again, focusing on the word comprehensive, I would say no, I don't think it's comprehensive. I think we do have an overview.
Okay. How are the sites for, like the location, the sites for where the water quality monitors will be located? How is that determined?
Well, there is a description of the intent of locating a site as part of the table that you mentioned, but briefly, it's intended to give, the program is intended to give an idea of the changes in water quality, for example, as you go downstream. So we begin with sites that are far enough upstream to be upstream of major urban developments, major economic activity like pulp mills, etc. That would give us some idea of the general background water quality. And then as you go downstream, sites are selected, for example, to be downstream of major cities or industrial activity or major tributaries. And then the tributaries themselves would also be measured as close as feasible to their confluence with the main stem so that their input could be estimated as well. I think, and my understanding is the farthest downstream site, which is at Hope, was selected years ago to be as far downstream as one could get and not be under the influence of tides with respect to flows. We don't, the salt wedge I don't believe gets that far, but perhaps it does. But the flow can be modified by tidal cycles. And so the farthest downstream that we were meant to go in this program was Hope to avoid that tidal cycles. The site at Hope is also, we believe, representative of what's going into the estuary to be compared with measurements made in the buoy on the main stem that you mentioned, which is clearly under the influence of tidal cycles, etc. So it depends on what site you're talking about. Some are reference sites, some are meant to give us an indication of the water quality downstream of major activities, and some are meant to give us, to be representative of tributary basins and their input to the main stem as a whole.
And who is it who determined the location of the sites in the Fraser? Was that done by?
No, that was done jointly with the province by the program, the monitoring managers, and approved by those accountable for the program.
Okay, was it, did you involve the Department of Fisheries and Oceans in the siting of any of the water quality monitors?
Well, I wasn't involved in it, but not to my knowledge, no.
Is the Department of Fisheries and Oceans consulted in terms of the appropriate parameters to be measured?
I don't know of any formal consultation, no.
Ultimately, who is responsible for determining the parameters that will be measured?
The people managing this agreement and the folks who are accountable for the program itself.
Okay, would it be the Director General of Water Science and Technology where you were?
Yes, ultimately it was me as Director General.
Okay.
In terms of accountability, not in terms of actual choices, but ultimately I was accountable for it. That's correct.
The business plan that we were just looking at refers to a type of sampling described as cabin. Can you explain what that is?
Yes. Some years ago we became a little bit concerned, even for the most frequent of these sites, for example. They're monitored on a bi-weekly basis in their grab sample. They don't tell you what came down the river 12 hours after you sampled. And they also are quite limited by the number of parameters you have the budget to measure and that your laboratory can measure. So we became concerned that we didn't get this comprehensive picture of water quality that we would like, either integrated over time or integrated over the cumulative effects of a number of parameters. We realized that there are organisms, insects, mostly invertebrates, that live in the mud in these sites that can't move around, that are exposed to everything that happens, and that if we could develop a program that measured them on a regular basis and compared what was happening to those invertebrate communities, that would be more reflective, a more comprehensive picture of water quality, to use your term. So it's been going on. The program has been developed over the last 20 years. The concept is to develop a database of the benthic, the community living in the biological community living in the mud, for a number of reference sites, sites that we perceive to be either not polluted or minimally polluted or disturbed. And having that database in hand, you can go to other sites and compare the communities that you find for comparable sites and determine if they're similar or not. And the degree of similarity, we believe, is a general indication of the degree of water quality, whether it's similar to unpolluted sites or not. So that program was developed. As it was developed, it was ground truth, shall we say, in a number of sites, including the Fraser system. And it continues to be applied in a very limited way in BC, especially in the Fraser system.
All right, that was my next question. Is it in existence right now? Is it being used in the Fraser right now?
To a limited extent. My understanding is the site at Hope is monitored every year and has been for the last 7 years. The other sites that I mentioned are monitored on a 2 or 3 year cycle. So for most of those, we have a couple of data points going back to the last 6 or 7 years.
So, sorry, the other 6 sites on the, or the other 5 sites on the Fraser?
That's my understanding, yes. And it is now part of this Canada-BC agreement on water quality monitoring. So it falls under the agreement. The activity is jointly managed, and my understanding is the province is using it. Well, we're using it jointly for all of the sites, all 39 of the sites.
And is the information that's derived from the cabin monitoring informative of sockeye health in the river?
Not directly. I might also say that that with respect to the Fraser, my understanding is the original database, the reference database, because that's another activity. It isn't just what you go and use it for. It's keeping the database up to date. The original reference database was comprised of 274 sites in the system. Work under the agreement that's underway right now will add 200 more.
Sorry, this is for the whole province or for the Fraser
Fraser
alone? Okay.
200 more. Because it's very important, the number of sites you have in your reference area database gives you the power of the analysis to go and compare.
And these are reference sites for the cabin monitoring?
Yes.
Okay.
And then there's a couple hundred more, I believe, on tributaries as part of the database as well. So an important activity under this program is to maintain that database. And the reason it's important is because companies like pulp mills or other folks who are interested in determining health at a specific site have access to that database. So they don't have to reproduce the program, they just have to go and sample their site, and they're able to compare it to similar sites within the database.
So the idea is to sort of take in a snapshot in time on these reference sites that are minimally polluted and say this is what it looks like today, and in the future people can use that to assess their sites.
And an important activity under the agreement is to keep that database up to date so people can assess their sites against an up-to-date database.
Right. How often are those reference sites updated?
Well, that's what I'm saying. Those references, there's 200 of those underway right now to be updated.
200 to be, sorry, maybe I misunderstood. I thought you said there was 274 initially, and then you were going to add 200, or will you be resampling some of the original?
Some of those involve resampling, and some of those are additions.
I see.
But the general idea is to ensure that, obviously, if the 200 sites we sample now were quite different than the 274 we had, we'd have to go back and look at what had changed, whether it was water quality conditions or water flow conditions or climate or whatever.
Right. And what's the schedule to do those reevaluations? Is it every 10 years or every 5 years, or?
It's an ongoing process.
Okay. How do you decide when you need to go back and resample those locations?
No, I don't know the answer to that. That's decided at the working level.
Okay. The water quality monitoring kind of broad brush that we've been talking about under the BC federal agreement, that has a number of different purposes. Is that fair?
Well, it's certainly used now for a number of different purposes. It started out as support for the activities intended under the Canada Water Act, which was the protection of the quality of Canada's water resources, and also to ensure the wise and efficient use of water resources. But it is the main water quality network for people who have other questions with respect to water quality.
Is the purpose of the monitoring to assess receiving water quality for Fraser River sockeye?
No.
And what about water quality in the marine areas? Is there any water quality monitoring being done by Environment Canada in marine areas aside from the buoy that you mentioned?
The only program that I'm aware of, the only monitoring that I'm aware of is done under the Canadian Shellfish Sanitation Program. And that is a program that's a joint program run by 3 departments: Fisheries and Oceans, Canadian Food Inspection Agency, and Environment Canada. Each have different roles. Environment Canada's role is to, in part, monitor waters where shellfish are commercially harvested for their microbiological content to determine if there has been inputs of sewage, for example, or microbes, harmful microbes that would affect whether the product could be sold or not. That's the only marine monitoring, water quality monitoring that Environment Canada conducts that I'm aware of.
Do you understand who has responsibility for monitoring marine water quality other than the shellfish?
Well, we assumed it was the Department of Fisheries and Oceans.
Okay. You covered a number of topics yesterday, which is going to allow me to move a little more quickly through some of our questions with you today. So I'd like to move ahead to you, Dr. Paradis. First, I'll just ask you, maybe I'll ask both Dr. Carey and Paradis. Yesterday, we heard from the witnesses from your respective organizations that there is no formal mechanism for the provision of science advice from DFO to Environment Canada. Do you just agree with that proposition or disagree?
I don't disagree.
You don't disagree?
No.
Okay.
I think I would, if you're talking about a formal structure where people regularly meet and information is exchanged, I would agree. I would say, however, that when Environment Canada, for example, gazettes or places in the Canada Gazette a notice with respect to some intention to regulate, there is a formal process for comments to be sent. Those comments are solicited by the department and are welcome from anyone, including DFO scientists, and so they can participate in that formal process. So in terms of a bilateral committee between Environment Canada and DFO to exchange information, I would agree that does not exist as a formal process. But there are formal processes for submission of information, and that information is welcome.
Avail itself of that opportunity?
It depends on how far back you go, and I am retired now. Certainly, for example, in the early 1990s, DFO were active participants in our development of amendments to the Fisheries Act regulations for pulp and paper. Mm-hmm. They had the lead scientifically, provided us with a large amount of information. Later on in the that wouldn't be the late 90s, it'd be, best of my knowledge, around 2004. When we were again looking at the amendments to the pulp and paper regulations, DFO participated on the steering committee for that process that I led and provided information at that time. So yes, they provide information from time to time.
And those examples you gave are specific regulations under the Fisheries Act?
They are.
Okay. Dr. Paradis, if I can just ask you to move to a document, tab 10. This is an email chain, but the final email is from you to Patrice Simon, Robin Brown, Peter Ross, and others. And this relates to an issue where DFO felt that it needed to advise Environment Canada on the effects of PBDEs. This is dated in 2008. Can you provide some background on what was this exchange about from your perspective? Do you remember?
Well, as Dr. Carey just pointed out, Environment Canada was going through a review of those products, and Dr. Ross and other scientists wanted to make a contribution to Environment Canada to help them to make the regulatory decision. And what we did is we asked them to go through the departmental process, which is the CSAS peer review process, in order to do it in the formal way that DFO does it. So following that, I sent the document to Mr. Innie, and Environment Canada replied that we're thankful for what we did, and, they would use it in the regulatory process, but we agreed that, the process had been fairly difficult to get into, because of the way it had been launched and moved forward. So there was a need to actually improve that process. If I may suggest, a similar process exists with PMRA in regard to pesticide, where there's more frequent meetings between the two organizations, and that does facilitate the process a great deal. So that's certainly something we had in mind at that time.
In your email at that time, the very top email in the chain, second sentence says, as you'll see in the future, both DGs, Director Generals, have agreed that a more formal exchange would be beneficial to ensure we can manage the workload and cost of developing the documents in the peer review meeting. That was after receipt of the CSAS review. Did that actually happen? Was a formal exchange developed?
No, we never got to do it.
I'll have that email marked, please. It's the next exhibit.
Exhibit 994.
Sorry to interrupt, Ms. Baker. I just wanted to, for the record, say that yesterday I referred to the same document and I mistakenly identified it as Exhibit 742. So in yesterday's transcript, this same document will be misidentified.
Would you like, I'm asking both Dr. Paradis and Dr. Carey, would you recommend any changes to the process for delivery of science advice between DFO and Environment Canada? Do you see any improvements that could be made there?
Well, I think, more regular interaction or, being, okay, I understand there's a public, call for submission, but, I think a more formalized process by which the DG could exchange about what Environment Canada is actually going through, or if DFO actually finds substances that would deserve some special attention, could certainly be put in place to facilitate those exchanges.
I think my response would be somewhat different. I think that Environment Canada welcomes this information, and I think Environment Canada would likely, I don't speak for the department now, I'm no longer an employee of the department, but I think that they would likely welcome more informal routes. Formal routes tend to be that generate their own life, and Environment Canada actually solicits information very broadly from comments from industry, and therefore I think setting up individual one-on-one formal arrangements would be which have its own transaction costs with respect to running them. And I'm not sure it would be worth setting up in terms of formal, if the barrier is, as I understand it, the barrier to getting information out of one department to another, having a formal process may not necessarily address that. Perhaps it's having informal contacts and exchange would be more efficient, frankly.
And it sounds, from hearing both of you, that there is a bit of an inability, or probably not deliberate, but there's just not a communication stream right now between Department of Fisheries and Oceans and Environment Canada. So how would you envision that more informal process coming about?
In the past, we've had memorandum of understanding where we had multi-department working groups. In fact, we had one on toxic substances for a number of years under a memorandum of understanding that went by the acronym 5NR, which is the 5 natural resource departments. So the 5 departments that were signatory to this were Environment Canada, Agriculture, Health, DFO, and Natural Resources. Working groups were formed, including working groups on toxics, on pesticides, on climate change, ozone depletion, and they exchanged information quite well in those days. That agreement expired and was not renewed. I think probably 10 years ago now. Perhaps Sylvain remembers. I'll just say 10 years ago now, and my memory may be faulty. So I think we have had these types of structures in the past, and as I say, they tend to be managed by ADM committees. The ADM committees are fed by DG committees, and then the DG committees are fed by working groups, and they have their own structure. And at some point, if nothing's happening, you know, I can recall trying to get one shut down because not much was going on effects of ecosystem effects of UV, but everybody was afraid to shut it down, and so, you know, you had to meet, even if you had nothing to say. So I have to say, in my career, I've developed kind of an aversion to formal structures unless they were needed and issue-based, and a wish that they could be shut down a little more easily when the issue had been addressed and passed.
I understand that in the late 1990s you were involved in developing a network between departments to integrate science work. Can you explain what that was about?
I can. I don't remember the year of the particular speech from the throne. It sticks in my mind it might have been 95. But the government at that time, whatever speech it was, said that they had a line in there saying that they would work with partners across the country to enhance the role of the National Water Research Institute. I was the executive director and then director general of the National Water Research Institute, and I was asked to produce a plan with specific items that how the National Water Research Institute's role could be expanded across the country. And one of the suggestions that I presented was to develop a national network for coordination of water-related research. This was presented to an interdepartmental ADM committee Deputy Minister Committee, who determined that they didn't think it needed a new budget to do that, so we should get started right away. And I held a number of, or Cosby held a number of workshops. I think it was 7 or 9 in number, involving other departments, and Dr. Parody was a representative from DFO, and we reviewed the water research programs in all departments, and including the National Research Council, so departments and agencies. We identified 27 general areas of that seemed to be priorities. From that, we selected a smaller number. We drafted a framework saying that the federal government had 4 broad goals in conducting water science. One was for the protection of human health against water-based hazards. One was for the protection of ecosystem health against impacts of human activities. One was for the protection of aquatic resources like fish and water itself to be exploited. And the 4th was for the protection of hazards from water like floods and droughts. Those were the 4 broad goals, and under that we identified, as I recall, 7, number could be wrong, seems to be 7, priority areas of collaboration. So under the 3rd item, protection of aquatic resources, one of the areas that the priority areas of collaboration we identified was producing the science and information required by the federal government to manage aquatic resources like harvested fish and shellfish. And so we produced that framework. It was a framework for cooperation. Along the way, there were some changes in the organization of government. Something called the ADM Integration Committee was formed, and they adopted water as one of their priorities and adopted our exercise and tried to manage it. A Deputy Ministers Committee was formed under Dr. Arthur Carty when he became science advisor to the previous government, and they determined that integration, which was a buzzword at the time, was a desirability, and water would be one of their priorities. And so we made presentations to them. They were about to take it on when the government fell. New government came in with different priorities. Dr. Carty's job changed and he left. The DM committee, well, half of the DMs were replaced and everything went back to square one. So we produced a framework, we produced sort of a plan. It was still not funded and was never implemented.
And that network or integrated science group, or however you described it, it had which agencies were involved in it?
Well, the main agencies were the five that I mentioned, but it also had Pesticide Management Regulatory Agency as a separate agency, the Canadian Food Inspection Agency, even though they are respectively part of Health Canada and Agriculture Canada, they were represented as separate agencies. And from time to time, the National Research Council also participated in our programs.
And would you agree that that integrated science planning framework that you developed would be a benefit to ensuring that Fisheries and Oceans and Environment Canada were working towards the same priorities?
Well, again, as I say, I think it would be a benefit to have all departments work with their oars in the water on some of these issues, and so it obviously would help Fisheries and Oceans and Environment work together as part of that activity.
And Dr. Paradis, did you support this endeavor
Well, I think
as
a
well?
multi-departmental committee would probably be best.
Dr. Paradis, during your time with DFO, the science sector, when you were the head, a large part of your work involved reviewing the toxic chemical program, research program, is that right?
Yeah, when I came in May, the review was actually quite completed. The report was tabled in June, so.
Okay, and the report that you're talking about is the strategic review that we saw yesterday. It's now marked as Exhibit 980. Is that right?
That's it.
Okay. I just want to, it's a bit out of order in chronology, but there's a useful page in another document which has already been marked, which is now marked as Exhibit 982. This is March 2005, so it's a little bit out of sequence, but first of all, did you prepare this set of
Yes, I did.
PowerPoints, or whatever they're called? All right, if you turn in this to the page 8, you can see at the bottom there should be a CAN number, so page 8 and 9. So those two pages they're not going to all show on the screen at the same time, but you should have them in a binder on the table there. This is called The Rise and Fall of Toxic Research in Canada. Can you explain to us what these two pages and this theme, which you call Rise and Fall of Toxic Research in Canada, is describing?
Well, this deck was actually intended to have a discussion with the environmental science manager within DFO to talk about the overall context we were asked to manage in the review, and eventually to start to lead in a reduction for the environmental review committee. And basically what we were stating is the fact that, with the green plan, toxic chemical research had received huge amounts of funding. Then the Norton Contaminant Program actually brought most departments together, like the science department together, to work in the Arctic. Then the TSRI, that was managed by Environment Canada and Health Canada, was another source of funding. And then all of those programs, the green plan got A-base, turned into permanent funding in the department. Then the Norton Contaminant Program changed shape considerably and lost like $6 million funding. The TSRI, I don't know when it got completed, but didn't get renewed.
Just for the record, he's looking at me because I was co-chair of that program. I can answer that question later. If you like.
You can actually chime in now if you've got some information that's helpful. Oops.
The TSRI was a commitment by the federal government to spend $40 million over 5 years on toxic contaminants research. We set up the program. The money was spent. We applied to get it renewed, and a decision was not taken to renew it.
Okay, thank you.
That would be, I'm guessing, again, 2002, 2003 that it ended.
Okay, all right.
So basically, because we were seeing a lot of those funding sources disappear, we really had to refocus our program. And that's basically what I was actually bringing to the attention of our managers.
All right, and if you could Mr. Dunn, if you could move the next page up, it shows us a chart. What is this showing?
Okay, the ESSRF was the Environmental Science Strategic Research Fund. It was actually the funding envelope for the Habitat Protection Program, like science activities. So you can see that there was funding for aquaculture, chemical, ecosystem-based management, which is kind of a term for ocean science. Okay. Aquatic invasive species. So, the regions were given like priority areas. The scientists would put proposals in. The National Environmental Science Managers Committee would meet and then, allocate the funding for the projects during the year. When I joined DFO, this fund had actually been rolled up into a larger fund to become the Science Strategic Fund. So all of those streams of funding were not actually directed any longer. All the funds were actually reassessed by the National Science Directors Committee.
Okay. The toxic chemicals program, as it's described in the strategic review document, and I think even in this PowerPoint, was it actually a separately funded program constituted as its own federal program, or was it something else?
No, it wasn't really a program. It was like a research area where people could do stuff. Because I wouldn't use the term program, because program would have like clear objective, like measurements, like accountability, performance. Like, we didn't have all of those objectives. Anyway, they've never been presented to me, because when I came in, basically the funds to support those activities had already been rolled up into a larger fund.
Well, before you got there, the funded program within the department?
I think there was money that came through the Green Plan, but I haven't managed a program at that point in time.
Okay. You said that when you arrived into this job in 2003, the strategic review document had been completed, and so I'll just ask you to turn to that again. That's Exhibit 980.
Yeah.
Thank you. And can you just explain why, to your understanding, why was this review done? Why was this document prepared?
As you probably know, there's been a number, I would say after like program review in the 90s, the government has actually engaged in almost a permanent process under different names for review of its activity and reprioritization of activities. So when I came in DFO, we had the Departmental Assessment and Alignment Project that was actually looking at, realigning activities and priorities. And I think a bit earlier, it had been requested that the toxic chemical review took place to figure out where the program was going, if there was any changes that needed to be made.
Okay, when you joined then in May, were you asked to make some changes to the toxics work being done in the department?
No, I didn't make any changes because, I was new, so I went through and, it was actually supported by all the people, like the environmental science managers, with some consideration. But I didn't make changes myself.
Were you directed, was not part of your job when you joined this department, was to implement some of the recommendations and the reviews that were on the table?
Yes.
Okay. So who asked you, where was the direction coming from to make those changes to
The National Science Directors Committee.
Okay, and who's on that committee?
It's the Director Generals in Ottawa, the ADM, and the Regional Science Directors.
All right. Were you asked to make any funding changes to the toxics program?
Well, they had already been made because, the ESSRF had been rolled into the strategic fund. And basically, there was no directed fund any longer, nationally, to run toxic chemical activities. It doesn't mean there was none, because there were some funds in the region, but nationally there was not a competitive fund to continue to fund those activities.
So what kind of a reduction in funding did that mean if there was no national funding available?
Well, for all of the activities listed here, aquaculture, toxic chemical, like the ESSRF was $5 million. Mm-hmm. So $5 million got transferred to the Strategic Science Fund.
And how much was intended to be reduced, though, in terms of funding for toxics?
Well, at that point in time, there was no specific target for reduction. Shortly after, the Expenditure Review Committee requested a reduction of $2 million in the toxic chemical program.
And was that your job then, to try and find a way to remove $2 million from the budget?
Yes.
Okay. Did any specific direction come to you along with the direction that you were to remove $2 million from the budget? Were you told where it should be taken from?
No, we were suggested to sit with the environmental science manager, and that's why we use this other deck, the blue one, to actually come to some recommendation to senior management.
Okay, can you go through that with us? Where did you see the cuts coming?
Well, actually, the thing is, we have 13 different institutes or sites where we had toxic chemical activities, which meant it was a very expensive, program to run from an equipment perspective. So the first suggestion was that we would actually roll up those centers, the analytical capacity, into a few sites, one in Sydney at the Institute for Ocean Science, one at the Institut Maurice Lamontagne in Montjoly. And then, because the hydrocarbon program was in the BIO at Cougar, so we left it there. And the pesticide program had been set up in Winnipeg, so we kept it as two satellite of the main centers. What it was meant to do was actually to decrease the cost of purchasing equipment because, in many cases, the machines were not operating at full capacity. And it also meant that, instead of having technician, running lower operation, we could actually concentrate and have a higher performance in a few centers. So we're consolidating expertise.
We heard yesterday from Dr. McDonald that there was a decision taken to stop work in fates and transport of contaminants. Is that also a decision that came out of the review?
It came out of the strategic review, and I would say the general feeling was that after the Green Plan and a lot of those research, a lot of information was there about levels in the ecosystem and the environment, but for a lot of this information, it was very difficult for us to figure out what it really meant. So that's why people recommended that we had to strengthen the biological impact side so we could actually interpret the numbers we were collecting in the ecosystem. On the policy side, there's a big issue in government about creating a bridge from science to policy. So often the policy people will say there's 3 questions, and Karen Dodds, who was my EDM at Health, said, there's the what, so what's out there, the so what does that mean, and the now what, where are we going with this information? So I think one of the issue was a lot of people were concerned about the fact that it was very difficult to figure out what the so what was all about. We had all those numbers, but in many cases we couldn't actually say what was the real impact of those things. It actually came up in the pesticide program that we've set up the capacity to be able to do a lot more of those biological impact and mixture studies. So, in Winnipeg, we've set up this lab with a series of aquariums side by side where you can actually control concentration, mix of chemicals, on same species of fish, so you can actually detect any changes in the biology or, the reactions and so on. So we've actually promoted to do a lot more of that stuff because, we needed to know better what was going on out there.
Was there any consultation with Environment Canada through the National Science Directors Committee to review what changes would be made in the toxic chemicals program at DFO? So was there communication between Environment Canada and DFO on the changes that were going to be made?
Not really while we were developing the proposal because, they were budget-related proposal. If you look in the budget at 205, this proposal has actually been approved and is listed. So there was no extensive communication. Well, there might have been some, but I wasn't privy to those. Okay.
Sorry?
That, just to clarify, in the development of the strategic review, there was consultation
With Environment Canada?
with Environment Canada. And I know that because I was the person who provided Environment Canada's views to the folks working on the strategic review early on the review, before Sylvain came on board and before this report was developed. We provided comments and we were aware of the process as it was being developed.
All right.
So I think, I haven't looked at it in a long time, but I believe later in the report it mentions Environment Canada's views with respect to some of the conclusions in the report.
And once the decisions were taken to actually implement the cuts, which flowed later on, a few years later, was there consultation with Environment Canada at that time?
Not that I'm aware of. So just to be clear, we had input into some of the recommendations and the development of the recommendations, but the implementation of those recommendations was an internal DFO matter in our view, and DFO were left to handle it to themselves. It did not involve us.
Okay. Was there a coordination role, though, between Environment Canada and DFO in terms of the work that was not going to be done any longer by DFO? Once the decisions were made by DFO on how they were going to implement these changes, was there not a need to go back to Environment Canada and say, okay, this is now what we're looking after, so that means you're looking after other parts of the puzzle?
That would have been nice, but I wouldn't say that happened systematically, no. Okay. I would in fact say that for some of the decisions, Environment Canada, i.e. myself and my ADM, learned about them when they were publicly announced, when everyone else learned about them.
Dr. Paradis, were you, at the time you were making these changes to you're implementing the changes to the toxic chemical program, were you aware that DFO in the Pacific region had decided to eliminate its water quality unit?
No, I was,
Okay. Were you aware of the role the DFO water quality unit had in communicating between Environment Canada and DFO in the Pacific region?
no, I wasn't.
Okay.
Because the water quality program was in the habitat protection group, and which is one of the clients we were servicing from a science perspective. And I guess after decision got made, a lot of interaction happened region by region. So in Pacific region, the decision was the water quality unit would no longer exist, I guess, from what I've seen, and I wasn't part of those discussions. In the Great Lakes, discussion took place around the Great Lakes contaminant program. And but in other regions, I don't know if there's been any formal interaction.
You have said that the biological effects work in toxics was going to continue within DFO,
Yeah.
right? And no longer was there this ESSRF fund. So
Yeah.
and sort of the acronym is what again?
It's
Environmental
Science Strategic Research Fund.
Okay, and it was dedicated to toxics originally, right?
Not just toxics, all of the other issues, oil and gas, hydroelectricity, all the habitat-related areas.
Okay. But by putting the ESSRF fund into the general science funding, there was no longer sort of a dedicated amount of money for toxics anymore. That's right?
Not at a national level.
Okay. And with the loss of dedicated funding for toxics, didn't it make it more difficult then for biological effects to be researched within DFO? How did that work, as if the funding was delinked?
Yeah, I think there were two different things happening. When I came to DFO, the feeling was that Section 36 had been delegated to Environment Canada, and people were actually suggesting that DFO move out of toxic because they saw it as an area of duplication. And I think the feeling was between Section 36 and SEPA, Environment Canada had all the tools and the capacity to do it. So we were told basically to kind of wind down. The biological effect was recognized to continue to be an issue within DFO because we had the fish expertise to do those kinds of things.
And was funding allocated for biological effects research nationally?
Not nationally. The NSDC made the decision further that the scientists would actually come closer to what we call the client, and it's in one of the decks you've presented yesterday and that are on the table. The clients were basically the Species at Risk program, the fisheries management program, aquaculture, habitat, even Transport Canada and external other federal government organization that needed to have scientific support from us. So basically the idea was toxics should be funded through those programs to be more closely related to the specific issues in those.
So if one of those clients, as you described them, species at risk, aquaculture, habitat, et cetera, felt there was some research that needed to be done, they could then access through the science program that research.
Yeah, so for example, like in the St. Lawrence River, while we had the ESSRF, we were funding toxic level in beluga. And then, when the ESSRF got rolled up, the scientists turned to the Species at Risk program because beluga was on their listing, and they started to get funded by this program. So in fact, the results were going directly to the managers of that program.
Okay. Mr. Commissioner, we could take the morning break now if that's convenient.
I would like to do that, just not quite. I just want to, while I'm thinking of it, try to understand the time frame here. Dr. Paradis, in your CV, I hope I'm getting this time frame correctly, but you arrived at DFO in March 2006. Is that correct?
Nope. Nope. I came in 2003.
I'm sorry, I was just looking at your CV, so I'm not reading it correctly, but nothing turns on that. I just, it's the timetable you became Director General, I guess, Ecosystem Science Director.
Yeah, 2006, that's it.
What I'm trying to do is, in the discussions you've been having with Council this morning, I'm trying to put this in the context of the wild salmon policy.
Yeah.
and in particular, Strategy 3, which talks about ecosystem management. How, if at all, was there any discussion, consideration, views being tied together with respect to the wild salmon policy in British Columbia and its embracing as a national policy, and what you're talking about here, that is to say, the objectives of the wild salmon policy with respect to habitat ecosystem management, which mentions chemicals specifically. How is all that, if at all, coming together as we see what you've been describing are programs going away and challenges being faced between DFO and Environment Canada with respect to these areas you've been giving evidence on?
Well, the wild salmon policy was largely managed out of Pacific region.
Correct.
Okay, so we were not really part of the development of those. They were kind of brought in Ottawa to be moved in the system because they were regionally specific. What happened is with the toxic program, what we discovered is that it's almost like if the toxic program had been a separate stream outside of all those other programs. So the links were very difficult to accomplish. So by suggesting that the regions would now manage toxic chemical research, they had the opportunity to roll it up into their own regional activities. And the transition to an ecosystem perspective by creation of the Ecosystem Research Initiative was also an opportunity to bring all those scientists together, not to have them in isolation like we had them in the past. So that's basically how it played out.
And from a funding perspective?
Well, from a funding perspective, the Pacific salmon policy is actually, all the funding comes to Pacific region, doesn't stay in Ottawa in any form. So the idea was, by closing the National Research Fund, which was competitive fund, there was still money in the regions to operate activities. So the expectation was that it would be rolled up as a priority within regional programs and be dealt with.
And insofar as relationship between Environment Canada and DFO in this area and the wild salmon policy, were there any discussions around those
Not in
applications?
Ottawa.
Not in Ottawa.
No, the discussion would have been in the region.
All right. Thank you.
Thanks.
We will now recess for 15 minutes.